kind introduction. So, what I would like to do today is to give you an overview on the recent experience with renewable electricity support schemes in Europe. So on the one hand, to look at what is the current status, and also to look at what are recent trends and what to expect from the future. Starting in the next slide. Looking first at where we are today. We see that there's a great diversity of renewable electricity support schemes in the EU member states. So some countries apply feed-in tariffs, other feed-in premiums, some quotas, some tenders. But what is especially remarkable is that many countries apply a combination of different instruments. So the map of Europe is quite striped. And that is also remarkable because until a few years ago, there was the map looked basically blue or yellow. So for many years, there was a somewhat ideological debate going on feed-in versus quota schemes and what is the better support scheme. And you could read a lot about that both in the scientific literature, but also in the policy debate in Brussels. This was a highly debated topic. As we look at the map today, the picture looks more nuanced. We see member states have started to choose more tailor-made approaches. And this would especially also be the case if we look at secondary support schemes that are not shown on this map yet. So here we only show the dominant support instruments, but of course also many member states still apply secondary instruments like tax incentive, investment grants, and so on. Despite all this diversity, we can also perceive some key trends in renewables policy design and also some converging trends, which is interesting in the sense that it's a long-term goal of Europe to come to a more unified European energy market. And I will today explore three major trends. The first one being quota schemes losing ground. The second one, more and more countries use sliding feed-in premiums, or also called contracts for differences. And third, more and more countries experiment with tendering schemes. So these are three trends that only concern the direct support schemes. Of course, there's many other trends. But a closer look will actually give some insights on what is the reasons behind these trends. Starting first with the first two of them. So on the one hand, quota schemes are losing ground, and on the other hand, more countries use sliding feed-in premiums or contracts for differences. As you already see from the map, there's the countries that actually currently use quota schemes, also still for new installations, are on the one hand Sweden, which is one of the best practice example of a quota scheme, and will also continue to use the scheme in the future. Then there's UK, but they actually announced they will phase out their quota scheme. There is Poland, but again they announced they will phase out the system. Italy, which some way vanished from the map. I don't know what is the technical reason for this. They also, till about 2 years ago, they were using quota schemes which still exist for existing plants, but not anymore for new plants. So also they are phasing it out. Romania still continues to do so. So, and in the past there was even more countries. Sorry, I forgot Belgium, who also has a mixture of quota and fixed tariffs. So what we see that while quota schemes were relatively popular in the past, today more and more countries are abandoning those schemes. And then the second trend, more and more countries introduce sliding feed-in premiums or contracts for differences. So either coming from quota schemes or coming from fixed feed-in tariffs usually. And there, countries that have fairly recently introduced such schemes are the Netherlands. Denmark is using already for a longer time. Germany started in 2012. The UK announced that they will move to a contract for different scheme. And so in general, there is a certain trend towards those trends. Now, in order to understand what is behind those trends, we will look at the how those schemes are built up. So first, you might be aware that there's a general differentiation. Are support schemes volume-based or price-based? So do they give a volume and then the price is defined by some kind of market? That's the case for quota schemes. Or is the price of the support, is it predefined? And that's the case for feed-in tariffs and feed-in premiums. Now, looking at how, and by the way, these are only production support instruments. Of course, there's also investment support, but we don't look at them in this presentation because they are not the main support instruments in Europe for renewable electricity at the moment. Looking first at the quota scheme on the right, what do we actually see? We see in yellow how the electricity market changes over time. And on the other hand, in green, how the green certificate price develops over the same period of time. So basically, the revenue from a renewables producer perspective is the revenues it makes from selling electricity plus the revenue from the green certificate market. And as you can see, both prices are fluctuating. So there's a risk from the electricity market and from the green certificate market. Now, on the other hand, looking to the left, looking at the fixed feed-in tariff, the FIT, there we see this means usually a fixed payment per kilowatt hour is paid for a guaranteed period. Let's say 15 or 20 years in most countries. And the renewables producer gets this payment no matter what the electricity price is. So it actually doesn't even see the electricity price. It just gets this feed-in tariff over the full time. But of course, there's still the electricity market price in the background. So the difference between the market price and the support payment is paid either by consumers or by the public budget. But this is not visible to the renewables producer. Now looking at the middle, at the feed-in premium schemes, there we have different variants. On the left, you see a sliding feed-in premium scheme, or also called a contract for difference. In fact, there's a tiny difference between those two. So a sliding scheme basically sets a reference value similar to the feed-in tariff, and then uses electricity market benchmark, and then pays the support as a difference between the market benchmark and this constant support level. And it's still the renewables producer who will sell electricity on the market, but it has a quite stable income, or a very stable income, if it doesn't make mistakes, because it knows there will always be the difference, it will repay the difference between this overall support level and the market price. And so in the end, there will be a stable revenue. And here the small difference between contract for difference and the sliding premium, the contract for difference would actually also ask to pay back in times where the electricity market price is higher than the support level, so where the yellow goes beyond the blue bar. And in other support schemes, it's actually defined that this extra, what you can make in the electricity market, stays with the renewable producer. So it's he's lucky in that case. So in a way, this sliding feed-in premium is a scheme that is, from the revenue perspective, quite similar to a feed-in tariff, very similar in fact. But the major difference is that the renewables producer sells directly to the market, while in the case of the feed-in tariff, the integration into the market is done by the grid operator. There's also other cases of feed-in premium schemes. So in the middle, you see a cap and floor system. That's what in the past was applied in Spain. So basically, it means, again, the support payment is paid on top of the electricity market revenues, but there's a cap and floor. So if prices drop very low, then the support payment doesn't drop below a bottom price, and if it's very high, the support payment doesn't rise beyond the ceiling price. So in that sense, the market risk from the electricity market revenues is somewhat hedged or limited to a certain extent by this cap and floor in the support payment. Then in the middle on the right side, you see the fixed feed-in premium. That's in a way the most simple, but also the most risky type of a premium. So it means a support payment is paid on top of the electricity market price, no matter what the price is. And this then results in quite fluctuating revenues for the renewables producer. So summarizing this again, we see on the right, for the quota scheme, you have a certificate market price risk, and you have the full electricity market price risk. And that makes the scheme a relatively risky scheme from a producer's perspective. So producers have to cope with those two market price risks. On the other hand, in the case of the feed-in tariff on the very left, there's no market price risk at all. It doesn't even see the market price. While in the case of a sliding or capped feed-in premium system, there's limited market price risk. So it's the producer is exposed to this market price signals, but the risk is limited. While in a fixed feed-in premium, the producer is exposed to the full market risk, but only to the electricity market risk and not to a green certificate market risk. And again, as I mentioned before, under the feed-in tariff, the integration into the electricity markets is done by the grid operator, while in all other support schemes, the integration into the market is done by private actors. So the renewables producer sells directly to the market, quite often to some kind of aggregator. Why are we talking about risk that much? Well, in fact, the level of risk exposure plays a very crucial role for the effectiveness and efficiency of renewable support schemes. That's the lessons that we have drawn in different studies over the last years. And you can read it in many publications, and the principle is quite simple. So in a way, if a support scheme limits risks and exposes the producer to a low level of risk, then the investor has a high level of planning certainty. It will be able to access capital at low cost, so that the financing cost of the investment will be low. And as a consequence, also the required support level required from the state budget or consumers will be lower. And this is only looking at the cost per kilowatt hour, reduces the required support level and makes support efficient. Similarly, also this low risk approach also has an effect on the effectiveness of support. So because there's this high investor certainty, more investors are attracted, more are able to actually implement their projects, and this leads to a higher renewables growth. If support is sufficient to actually make investments viable, of course, is a precondition. But so we have analyzed that in many European projects. I will cite a few later on, for example, the reshaping project, where there was also some indicator work comparing in quantitative terms the effectiveness and the required investor profit or efficiency for of support schemes per kilowatt hour, and there you can see that those countries with a low risk environment do much better than those countries with higher risk environment. And it's also, as it's a basic principle of financing, you can also model that with a cash flow model, and that's what we've also done in one study for the European Commission, and the result was that risk mitigating support schemes can actually reduce the levelized cost of electricity and thus the resulting support cost by up to 30%, compared to a high-risk approach. So this shows that risk mitigation is really a crucial issue of renewable support policy design. Yes, and this, coming back to the trends we observed before, also explains some of the trends we saw. So because risk-conscious support policies are generally more effective and efficient and limit support costs to consumers, also more and more governments pay attention to this fact. And this was, several governments declared that they think their quota schemes are too expensive for renewable support, and that they believe they will be able to support renewables at lower cost with support schemes that expose producers to lower risk. You have to say, of course, there's no right or wrong. You can also design quota schemes in a way that it's more stable and reliable, but as a general tendency, you see that these schemes include a high level of risk, and this was a main reason why several countries turned away from it. And I think this is also especially relevant in the European context, where we have a liberalized electricity market. If you look, for example, at the US, the picture looks different, because there the renewable portfolio standards, which are also quota schemes, basically work relatively well, but also the electricity market is organized in a different way. So yes, low risk is a clear success factor of renewable support in Europe. On the other hand, it's also clear that exposure to market risk has a value, or may have a value. So from a macroeconomic perspective, someone has to take the risk, either it's a producer or a society. And a policymaker has to decide, well, who is best fit to take that risk? And if risk exposure actually triggers optimized behavior, so that the renewables producer adjusts supply to demand, then this can also be beneficial. And this is one of the key arguments why several countries are in favor of exposing renewables producers to market risks, but still not using the full risk, but limiting that risk to a certain extent. And in that sense, a sliding feed-in premium or contract for difference is seen as a good compromise between, on the one hand, revenue security, but on the other hand, still exposure to market price signals. And also an important role probably plays in this context that the European Commission has repeatedly called member states to expose renewables to market risk, and in that sense to move from fixed feed-in tariffs to feed-in premiums or other support schemes with market exposure. This whole issue is a bit broader, because there is, of course, a discussion on, well, is this actually the right approach for supply-driven renewables like wind and solar that cannot really easily adjust their production? but they basically they produce when the wind blows and the sun shines. On the other hand, there's still some flexibility, for example, to stop production in times of negative prices. So this is a whole debate ongoing. I won't go into that, but clearly the trend, and I think that's also based on the European Union's logic of having liberalized electricity market, where producers should participate in the markets and not use a single buyer. So there's a clear trend towards feed-in premium schemes, and especially to those sliding feed-in premium schemes or contract for differences that clearly limit the revenue risk. So this was the first two trends. Now looking at the third trend, and that's a quite interesting topic now in the policy debate in Europe. Countries are experimenting with tendering schemes. Probably people from other countries in the world might not find that so exciting, because in some countries, for example, also developing countries, tendering is used quite commonly. But as a support scheme for renewables in liberalized electricity markets, it's something relatively new for Europe, or there has been some experience in the past, already in the late 90s, which was not so successful. So for several years, tendering schemes were hardly applied in the EU, with some notable exceptions, of course. For example, France for a long time has applied tenders for certain technologies. But now we see tenders become more popular also with other countries. So Italy, which again vanished from the map here, I don't know why, has introduced a tendering scheme, I think last year. So moving away from their quota scheme. Germany has announced that they will replace their feed-in system eventually by a tendering scheme. At least they're considering to do so. The Netherlands are already operating a scheme which is a mixture of a feed-in premium with auction elements, so a mix of a tendering and feed-in premium scheme. The UK announced that they will use auctioning for the price setting in the contract for difference. And also Poland announced that they might follow the Dutch approach and introduce a mix of a feed-in and a tendering scheme. By the way, the definition of tenders and auctions, I won't go into details there because there's many different designs. But basically, just to give some fundamentals, a tender is not really a support scheme by itself, but it's how to say, a kind of a selection procedure to select qualified projects, and which then can be combined with all other support schemes. And the most common type is the combination with feed-in tariffs or feed-in premiums. So renewables producers participate in a tender, which is usually organized as an auction. So those projects that offer the lowest price will be will have an advantage. There's a limited volume in the tender that is available. Bidders can offer their price, and then at some point there's a cut, and then the successful bidders will receive support. So either the support level they offered or the support level of the clearing price. And those bidders who offered projects for higher support costs, they will not be successful and not be considered. So this shows that the support level is determined in the competitive procedure, which requires, by the way, that the demand for support is greater than the tendered volume. Clearly, otherwise there would be no scarcity or no price competition. And this is different from traditional feed-in tariffs or premiums, where the support level is determined administratively, so by the ministry or some agency or whomever. They usually calculate or levelized cost of electricity for certain technologies, so they make estimations for certain categories and technologies, and then define this price, and this is then applies to all renewables of that category. And as we have seen in the past in Europe, sometimes that works quite well, but sometimes also the support level is not well adjusted, so either too high or too low. If it's too high, then this will create a lot of windfall profit and can also lead to explosion of the market and high cost to consumers. If it's too low, then nothing happens. So no renewables plants are built. So that's one of the key challenges of administratively defined feed-in tariffs or premiums, and that's where tenders are considered an interesting answer to avoid that problem. But of course, tenders are not a simple answer to that problem, and they again have their own challenges and opportunities. And I would like to go now to some of those key challenges and opportunities. Looking first at the opportunities, a clear advantage from a policymaker's perspective is that the maximum volume of renewables supported, and thus also the overall support costs, are limited because you tender a limited volume. So the problem that we saw in some feed-in schemes, for example for PV in Germany or Italy, that really the market grew much faster than expected, that couldn't happen in an auction scheme. Another advantage, as I explained before, the support level is not determined by the administration but by the market, because market actors submit their bids. And through the competition between those bidders, there's also the potential to lower the actual support cost, because renewables producers have an incentive to bid the lowest price they can possible, and the lowest price possible should ideally be their real production cost plus a moderate profit that they need to realize the project. So in that sense, ideally, tendering auctioning schemes could also help to bring down the support costs per technology and to discover what are the actual cost of those technologies, which so far policymakers are just guessing. On the other hand, we also see that tenders have some significant disadvantages, or let's say challenges. One key issue is that not all winning projects will be implemented. So the implementation rate of tenders, like of all the successful bids that came out of a tender, is lower, always lower than 100%, and sometimes significantly lower. So, for example, I think there's some data from Brazil where only 40% of the projects that won the tender have actually been implemented, even though this might some of this might also be delays. So maybe the figure increased in later years. But basically, it can actually mean that a lot less projects are implemented than tendered. And from a policymaker's perspective, that is a challenge, because you have your policy targets, especially in Europe. We even have binding targets for each member state, how many renewables need to be reached. And this is, in that sense, even though tenders provide a good control of the maximum number of volume installed, they don't really provide an indication of what is the minimum volume installed, and that, in that sense, make it difficult to steer renewables growth. So this is one disadvantage. And by the way, how high the implementation rate is depends highly on the one hand, the pre-qualification requirements, and on the other hand, on the penalties that are part of the auctioning system. But these, so if you ask for already well-developed projects that are almost completed and can close to financial close and operation, and then of course the chance that those projects will be implemented is high, but on the other hand this also means high cost to the project developers. So this brings me to a second challenge of auctioning schemes, the higher risk for renewables producers compared to feed-in tariff or premium schemes that are defined administratively, and this higher risk also to some extent favoring bigger market actors. And yeah, basically there's risk on different levels. So on the one hand, you have the uncertainty when you prepare for a tender, because you don't know if your project will be successful. So there's this uncertainty in that phase where you already have to spend money on pre-developing your project. Then if the project is not successful in the tender, then the project developer has sunk cost because it invested in the project development before but won't get support for the project. On the other hand, if you look at projects that have been granted support, then there's still the challenge that they have to be implemented in time, and if something goes wrong, then the project would have to pay a penalty, and this is also linked to some risk Of course, it makes sense that there should be penalties, but they also add a risk premium to the cost of the project developer. Finally, there's also some challenge with the price setting in auctioning schemes. So on the one hand, we observe in some countries that bidders submit very low bids, so very low prices, which are actually below, or assumed to be below production cost. And then this pushes other bidders out of the market and also doesn't make it more likely that projects are implemented. So this is called underbidding. Also the winner's curse plays a role here. On the other hand, there can also be strategic behavior on then leads to very high bidders reach a high result. I mean, those trends can be avoided, but this is, of course, a question: is there easy solution how to do it? Yeah, which brings me to the conclusions on the on tendering schemes. In a way, it's too early to really conclude on overall best practice design for tendering or auction schemes in Europe because there's limited experience, and this experience is quite mixed. So probably further learning is required. But we can already identify some success factors for designing tendering schemes right. And that is, on the one hand, to adjust the tender design to the specific renewables market structure. So know how many actors there are, what are the project-specific risks, and then design the auction accordingly, because auctions are very sensitive to market conditions. So this is one important element. Another important element is to find the right balance between penalties and pre-qualification requirements. That increase the implementation rate, and on the other hand, rates also comes at high cost. So this is kind of allow time for testing, evaluating, and upscaling the tendering schemes. So the European Commission, in the draft state aid guidelines that will be published later this week, seems to call for increased use of auctioning schemes, which is, might not be a problem in the future, but where you should be careful on under what conditions can they actually apply it, and do you already have enough experience how to do it. So much about tendering. There's, of course, other trends and challenges I cannot explore in this presentation because time's almost up. So, but just to give you an idea and mention a few key topics that we are looking at in other projects. So one problematic trend is, of course, that countries that are in economic crisis or have bad experience with renewable support, that they have stopped their support schemes or changed them retroactively. But on the other hand, we still have renewables targets in Europe, and so the question arises how to attract renewables investments in those countries under strong budgetary constraints, and also how to phase out support in the future, because in a way that's the goal to reach a status where you don't need to pay extra support to renewables. So these are questions that we are looking at in new European projects towards 2030, it's called. Another development, which I wouldn't call a trend yet, but where we might see more activity in the future, is the cooperation between member states. So far, there's not much cooperation, one has to say, but some member states have said they want to look into the opening or partial opening of their support schemes. So there the question would be, how would that actually work in practice? And also looking beyond 2020, what will be the role of cooperation beyond 2020 after the current renewables directive? Is it possible to further align and cooperate between member states to make renewable support more European? And finally, a last question I would like to raise is, of course, we see that high shares of renewables already impact the electricity systems and markets. You can see that all across Europe. So, for example, price volatility, sometimes negative prices, different export patterns, and so on. And there the question again arises how to further align renewable support policies with the general power market regulations and policies. So these are all questions and trends. We could spend another few hours of web lectures, but I would like to stop here. Here you find a list of recent publications that deal with the issue of renewables electricity support in Europe, where I would invite you to do further reading. And if you have any question to me or my colleagues, feel free to contact us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Corinna, for your presentation. Very interesting. So let's go now for questions and answers. So allow me to